Before I tell you what I saw on that rooftop, I need you to stay with me. Not because this story is easy to tell. It isn't. It has taken me years to say it out loud. But because what happened to me changed the way I see every single room I walk into, every hand I hold, every name I write in a chart. And if you are the kind of person who has spent years being certain about something, absolutely certain, then I think you might need to hear this too. So please, stay. My name is Amina Farouk. I am a nurse. I have been a nurse for 12 years, most of them in the ICU of a large public teaching hospital in Amman, Jordan. I have seen more people die than I can count. I have held the hands of strangers in their final minutes. I have watched monitors flatline and then quietly reached over and turned off the sound. I have comforted sobbing families in the hallway and then walked directly back into the ward and prepared the bed for the next patient. This is not cruelty. It is how you survive the job. You build walls. You keep the emotion outside the room. You become very good at being present without being affected. I was exceptional at it. Everyone said so. I believed in medicine completely. Lab values, imaging, diagnoses, treatment protocols. The body was a system and the system had rules, and if you understood the rules you could fight for the patient. That was my world, measurable, logical, real. I also believed in Allah. I prayed. I fasted every Ramadan without fail. But I want to be honest with you. Faith had become something I maintained the way some people maintain a tidy desk. Because it belonged there. Because it always had. Not because it reached me anywhere deep. I don't think I had been reached anywhere deep in a very long time. The thing about working in intensive care is that you stop noticing the extraordinary, because the extraordinary becomes ordinary. A man breathes on a machine for 3 weeks and then breathes on his own. A woman's kidneys shut down and then quietly restart. The body does impossible things constantly. So you stop saying impossible. You say unexpected. You say atypical. You write it in the notes and you move on. That is exactly what I did the first time it happened. It was a Tuesday. I remember, because Tuesdays were my longest stretch. I came on at 7 in the morning, and the ward was already humming. I had 6 patients that shift. The one in bed 4 was a man named Dr. Khalid Mansour, 82 years old. Retired mathematics professor. He had been admitted 10 days earlier with multi-organ failure. His kidneys were down. His liver numbers were climbing in the wrong direction. His family had been called in twice, but he had no family nearby. His former students had visited in the first week. After that, the visits stopped. He spent most of his time sleeping. I liked Dr. Mansour even though he rarely spoke. There was something dignified about the way he lay in that bed. Like he was simply waiting for something with no particular anxiety about it. I checked his vitals at noon. His blood pressure had dropped again. I adjusted the medication and charted the change and moved to the next bed. Around 2 in the afternoon, his monitor alarmed. I walked in fast. His breathing had changed. I called for the team and we ran the standard response, but his numbers kept falling. I stood at the foot of the bed watching the screen. We were losing him. Then he opened his eyes. Not slowly. Not the way patients sometimes flutter open and then close again. Wide open, fully alert. More alert than he had been in days. His gaze moved around the room, and then it found me. Just me. He looked directly into my eyes and something in his expression settled. Like he recognized me. Like he had been looking for me specifically. He smiled. And then he whispered. I had to lean in to hear it. I put my face close to his, because his voice was barely air. The gardener still waits for you. Then he exhaled one long, slow breath, and he was gone. I stood up straight. I looked at the monitor. I called the time of death. I spoke to the team calmly. I went through every step exactly the way I had hundreds of times before. I comforted the liaison. I made the call to his emergency contact. I documented everything. I documented nothing unusual, because I told myself there was nothing unusual. Terminal lucidity. It is a recognized phenomenon. Patients who have been unresponsive or confused sometimes experience a brief window of clarity before death. They speak coherently. They recognize people. The brain does strange things when it is shutting down. There is literature on it. I had seen it before. The words were odd. a little poetic, but dying people sometimes say poetic things. The mind reaches for images when language starts to fail. I filed it away and forgot it within a week. I did not forget it. I told myself I forgot it. 6 weeks later, I was assigned to the respiratory ward for a 3-day rotation. Short-staffed. I covered where I was needed. The patient in room 7 was a woman whose name on the chart was listed as Fatima. No surname on record. She had been brought in by emergency services after collapsing near a market in the eastern part of the city. Homeless. Somewhere between 50 and 70 years old. Severe pneumonia. Both lungs badly infected. She had been barely conscious since admission. She did not speak to the staff. She did not respond to her name. She drifted. The nurses on that ward had done what they could, but the infection was winning. I was doing a routine check on her IV line when she moved. Not a small shift. A deliberate turn of her head. She rotated until she was facing me, and I felt something strange before anything else happened. A stillness. The kind that isn't comfortable. The kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Her eyes opened. They were clear. Completely clear. Not the clouded, exhausted eyes she had shown the staff for days. Something had come into them. Something focused. She reached out. Her hand found my arm before I fully processed that she was moving. Her grip was stronger than I expected. She pulled me gently toward her. I let her. I leaned down. She looked directly into my eyes, and she whispered, "The gardener still waits for you." I did not move for several seconds. I stood there holding her hand, and I could not explain what was happening in my chest. Not grief. Not fear exactly. Something more like vertigo. Like the floor had shifted slightly under my feet without actually moving. She died 4 hours later. I went back to my station. I pulled up both files on the hospital system. Dr. Khalid Mansour, 82, retired professor, admitted from a private clinic in the Northwestern District. No known religious affiliation listed. No family contacts in Amman. Fatima, no last name. Estimated age between 50 and 70. No fixed address. Brought in from the Eastern Market District. Different intake wards. Different admitting physicians. Different everything. No connection. Zero overlap. I stared at both files for a long time. 2 people. Different ages. Different backgrounds. Different conditions. Different wards, different months, and the same sentence, word for word. I closed the files. I told myself it was coincidence. Language floats. Phrases pass through communities in ways we cannot track. Maybe it was a religious expression I wasn't familiar with. Maybe both of them had heard it somewhere. A sermon, a book, a piece of poetry. It meant nothing. It was a coincidence, and I was a nurse, and I believed in evidence, and there was no evidence here. Only 2 unusual moments that I was giving more weight than they deserved because I was tired. I was so tired. It was raining the evening I saw him the first time. I remember because I never liked leaving the hospital in the rain. The parking area had poor drainage, and by the time you reached your car, your shoes were soaked through. I had stayed an extra 40 minutes finishing documentation, and I was rushing. I pushed through the exit near the emergency department and nearly walked straight into him. He was crouching beside the potted plants that lined the entrance to the emergency wing, hospital plants, the kind no one really notices, usually slightly brown, usually forgotten. He was trimming dead leaves from the stems with a small pair of scissors. His gray uniform was the standard maintenance issue. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles. His beard was completely white, and his face was the kind of face that is hard to estimate an age for. Calm in a way that looked permanent. He did not look up when I stopped. He just kept working on the plant, pulling the dead leaves carefully, setting them to the side. I was about to step around him when he spoke. Sometimes the sick see farther than the healthy. I stopped. I turned around. He was still looking at the plant. His scissors moved to the next stem. I stood in the rain for a moment just watching him. He did not seem to be speaking to anyone in particular. He did not look up. I almost said something. Instead, I kept walking. But his voice followed me the entire drive home. It wasn't the words exactly. It was the tone. The same quiet certainty. The same undisturbed calm. The same unhurried quality. like someone speaking from a place that doesn't need to rush because it knows how things end. I convinced myself he just liked riddles. Some people do. He was an old man working in a hospital surrounded by illness and death, and he had probably developed his own way of processing it. Philosophical musings to no one in particular. Normal. Explainable. I was reading into it because I was unsettled about the two patients, and I was looking for connections that weren't there. I went home, I made tea, I slept badly. Several months passed. Spring became summer. I rotated back to the ICU. I had mostly stopped thinking about the whispers. The notebook was something I had started almost as a joke with myself. Whenever a patient said something striking near the end, I wrote it down. I told myself it was for a research paper I might write someday about language and dying. Really, I was checking. Every time someone whispered something in those last moments, I held my breath. Every time the words were different, I exhaled. No phrase repeated, except one. The young man's name was Tariq, 26 years old, construction worker. He had been brought in 3 weeks earlier after scaffolding collapsed on a work site. Internal injuries, multiple organ involvement. The surgical team had done everything possible, and for a while we thought he might pull through. He was young, his body was strong, but infection set in, and then his kidneys. And by the time his parents were called in for the final conversation, we all knew. His parents were devastated in the way only parents of young children can be. His mother sat on one side of the bed and recited prayers in a low, continuous voice. His father stood at the window with his back to the room because he could not make himself watch. I checked Tariq's lines at hour intervals. I adjusted his comfort medications. I spoke to his parents quietly when they needed water or a moment outside. Then his monitor changed. His heart rate had been weak and irregular for hours. Suddenly it steadied. Not the way hearts steady when they improve. A different kind of steadying. I had seen it before. It meant the body was gathering. I moved to the bedside. His breathing evened out. His eyes opened. His mother gasped and grabbed his hand. His father turned from the window. But Tariq did not look at either of them. He looked at me. Only me. Across the full room. Past his mother who was holding his hand. Past his father who had taken one step forward. Directly at me. With eyes so clear and so calm that I felt the back of my neck go cold. He opened his mouth. The gardener still waits for you. I stopped breathing. Then he added something. Something the others had not said. He held my eyes and said, very quietly, he has never stopped. His chest rose one more time, and then he was still. His mother's cry was the sound that broke the silence. His father made a sound I will never forget. The sound a person makes when something inside them cracks all the way through. I stood at the bedside and I could not move. I held the chart in my hands and I could not feel my fingers. One of the other nurses touched my arm and said my name. I nodded. I called the time. I did the steps. All of them. Correctly. On time. In order. But when I walked out of that room, something had changed. Not broken. Not fixed. Changed. Like a window that has been shut for so long you forgot there was a window and then someone opens it slightly. Not all the way. Just enough for air to come through. 3 patients. No connection. 3 months spread across a year. Different ages. Different backgrounds. Different conditions. Different floors. And identical words. Not similar. Identical. The same words in the same order, with the same quiet expression, and the same calm that sat on their faces, like something that did not belong to this world. I stopped sleeping well after that. Not fully. I would sleep for 2 or 3 hours, and then lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments. The way Dr. Mansour's eyes had found mine across the room. The way Fatima had pulled my arm toward her, before I understood she was moving. The way Tariq had looked straight past his own parents to find my face. I began reading. Everything I could find. I went through research papers on near-death cognition. I read studies on terminal lucidity, the phenomenon where patients with severe brain deterioration sometimes regain clarity in the hours or minutes before death. I read about shared hallucinations, about the psychology of hearing familiar patterns in unrelated speech, about the brain's tendency to create meaning from coincidence. I filled a notebook. Not the one I had started for patient quotes. A different one. Personal. Pages of notes from papers and articles and my own observations. I built timelines. Mapped every detail I could remember about each patient. I looked for anything I might have missed. Any possible thread connecting them. There was nothing. I knew the words by heart now. Not because I was holding on to them, because they would not leave. They arrived at random moments the way certain songs do. At the sink scrubbing in, at the counter signing off a chart, in the car at a red light. The gardener still waits for you. He has never stopped. Over and over. Not threatening, not frightening, just present. The way a question is present when you are trying very hard not to think about it. What was the gardener? A person? A metaphor? A religious image I was unfamiliar with? I searched Islamic scholarship. I searched Arabic poetry. I searched theology. Nothing landed. Nothing felt like the right fit. The phrase was specific and personal in a way I could not explain. The way it had been spoken to me directly. Not to the room. To me. I told no one. I did not tell my colleagues. I did not tell my family. Nurses talk. The ICU is a small world, and I had spent 12 years building a reputation for calm and competence, and I was not going to unravel it by saying that 3 patients had spoken the same sentence to me before they died, and I could not explain it. I would sound like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. One afternoon I stepped out of a patient's room and stopped. Across the hallway. He was there. The maintenance worker. The same man from the cafeteria weeks earlier. The same man from the emergency entrance in the rain. He was standing outside the hospital chapel, replacing the flowers in the large wall vase that sat beside the chapel door. His back was partially turned to me. He was setting each stem in carefully, one at a time. Like every flower mattered. Then he turned slightly and looked at me. No smile, no nod, no greeting. He just looked, directly across the hallway, with those remarkably quiet eyes, and held my gaze for a moment. I felt something I had not expected. Not fear. I want to be clear about that. Not fear. Something closer to being seen. Truly seen. The way you feel when someone looks at you and you just know, that they are not looking at your uniform or your title or your expression. They are looking at something beneath all of that. And it knows you. And it has been waiting, patiently, without any frustration, for you to look back. I turned away first. I walked to the nurse's station and sat down and opened a chart and stared at it for several minutes without reading a single word. That feeling stayed on me for the rest of the shift. Not unpleasant. Uncomfortable, the way truth sometimes is. Like when you know something is true but admitting it means rearranging everything else you have built around it. I started going to the rooftop. The hospital had a rooftop level above the top floor that most staff didn't know about. I had found it years earlier when I was looking for a quiet place to eat lunch. There was a door at the end of the 6th floor stairwell, heavy and slightly stiff, and on the other side was open air and a low concrete wall and a neglected garden somebody had once planted up there and then forgotten. Mostly dry, a few survivors, and a view of the city waking up in the morning. Started going after night shifts. I would finish charting and give handover to the morning team, and instead of going straight to my car, I would climb the stairs to the roof. I would make tea from the small machine in the staff room and carry it up in a paper cup. I would stand at the wall and watch the city turn from dark to pale gold. I would drink my tea and breathe clean air and try to locate myself inside whatever was happening to me. It became the best part of my day. I never told anyone about it. It was mine, just mine. Then one morning it wasn't mine alone. I pushed through the heavy door and felt the cool air and turned toward my usual spot at the eastern wall. He was already there, the maintenance worker, standing beside the neglected rooftop garden. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the plants. He did not turn when I opened the door. I stopped. My first thought was logical. Someone on staff must have told him the roof was up here. He had come to tend the garden. That was his job. Fine, I would come back tomorrow. But then I thought about what it takes to access this rooftop. The stairwell door required a staff keycard. I had never mentioned this place to anyone. In 3 months of coming up here, I had never once seen another person. He turned slowly and looked at me. The same eyes, the same absolute quiet. Something moved through me then. Not a thought, a recognition. Like when you hear a piece of music you are certain you have never heard before, and yet your body responds to it as though it knows every note. I walked toward him. I stopped a few feet away, and I said everything I had been holding for months. I said, "Who are you?" He waited. I said, "3 patients." 3 different patients said the same thing to me before they died. Word for word. The same sentence. And I have searched every explanation I can find, and none of them work. None of them. He was still. "And you?" I pointed at him. "You were in the cafeteria. You were outside emergency. You were by the chapel. And now you are here. On a roof that no one knows about. That requires access. So who are you, and how do you keep finding me, and what does it mean?" I was not crying. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. He looked at me for a long moment. The city was still dim behind him. The sky was beginning to lighten at the horizon, very slowly, like something being revealed. Then he said, gently, with no performance in it at all, "When was the last time you looked beyond the illness and saw the person?" I felt something tighten in my chest. I said, "I care for every patient." He nodded. Slowly, completely. "I know," he said. And then, very quietly, he said, "They remembered me because I never left them." My heartbeat became something I was aware of, loud in my ears, fast. The light was changing. It came slowly at first, the way light does before sunrise, that slow shift from gray to pale gold. But then it was more than that. Something about the rooftop was different. The air, the quality of the air. Not warmer exactly, fuller, denser with something I do not have a word for. I looked at the garden. Every flower was open, not all at once, not like a trick. I just looked and they were open, every one of them. The dry, cracked sections I had walked past for months. The brown stems, all of it alive. Green and bright and full and entirely impossible. I looked back at him. He was not dressed in gray anymore. I cannot tell you exactly what he was wearing, because when I try to remember it clearly, my memory gives me light more than fabric. I can tell you his face was the same shape, the same lines, but something in it had become visible, that had always been there, but that I had not been able to see before. The way certain stars are there in the sky all along, and you only see them when your eyes finally adjust. He was not the maintenance worker. He had never been the maintenance worker. I understood that completely in one single moment, and the understanding went all the way through me. Not like a thought, like water filling a space that had been empty for a very long time. Peace. Not the peace of a problem being solved, the peace of a presence. The peace of something that has always been and that will always be, and that is, in this moment, standing 2 feet away from you on a rooftop in the early morning and looking at you with more patience and more love than you have ever felt directed at you from any human being in your entire life. He looked at me the way the dying patients had looked at me. Exactly the same way. That was when I understood. Something clicked into place somewhere deep and quiet. Those 3 people in their final moments, whatever they had seen, whatever had come close to them as they were leaving, he had been there. And they had carried a message back, for me, to me, specifically. He said, "I called you through those who were leaving," he paused, "because you still had time." The silence after those words was total. The city below us had disappeared, the sounds of traffic and morning birds and the hospital humming below, all of it gone. There was only his voice and the light and the flowers open in the garden beside us. I have always been the gardener. He reached toward the garden, one hand gently extended. His fingers touched one leaf on a dry stem at the edge of the section I always noticed first, because it was the most neglected, the most forgotten. The leaf turned green. From the point where his finger touched it, the color moved outward through the plant slowly. Not fast, steady. The way warmth spreads through something cold. He looked back at me. "I came looking for you long before you started looking for me." I do not know what my face was doing. I do not know what my body was doing. I was aware of being present and also of being completely outside my ability to process what was happening. My mind had gone very quiet. Not empty, quiet. The way a room goes quiet when something important is being said and everyone in it knows to stop. The light grew brighter. It wasn't blinding. That is not the right word. It was full, overfull, more light than the space could ordinarily hold, and yet nothing was harsh about it. I could feel it on my skin. It was warm the way something is warm when it knows you. Not the warmth of a lamp or the sun. The warmth of being recognized completely. I raised my hand to shield my eyes. Not because it hurt, because something in me knew that there was a threshold here, and I was standing at it, and I was not ready to go further, and he knew that, and it was entirely acceptable, and there was no disappointment in any of it. I lowered my hand. The rooftop was empty. Only light, only morning, only the garden with every flower open. I stood there for a very long time. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe an hour. I do not know. My feet did not move. I was aware of the concrete under my shoes. I was aware of the paper cup of tea in my hand, cold now. I was aware of my own breathing. In, out, in, out. The most ordinary thing happening inside the most extraordinary moment of my life. I tried to do what I always did. I tried to rebuild the explanation, stress. I had been under enormous stress for months. The sleep deprivation was real. I had documented it. I had mentioned it to my supervisor, in a general way. Cognitive effects of chronic sleep disruption were well established. Hallucinations were possible. Perceptual distortions were documented in shift workers with long-term sleep interruption. I went through it all. Every rational framework I had, and I kept arriving at the same problem. It wasn't that I had no explanation. It was that I knew. I simply and completely knew the way you know certain things that require no argument because they have arrived in a part of you that sits below argument. The part that knows before the mind catches up. The part that had been trying to get my attention for months through 3 dying strangers and a man trimming flowers in the rain. I sat down on the low concrete ledge. I set the cold tea on the ground beside me. I looked at the garden for a long time. Then I reached into my bag. At the bottom of it, beneath my stethoscope and my notepad and my spare pen and the small case of personal things I always carried, my fingers found something thin and flat and slightly soft at the corners. I had to dig for it. I had forgotten it was there. Months ago, maybe a year, I could not remember. The daughter of a patient I had cared for in the ICU had pressed it into my hands as she left. Her father had survived against every prediction we had made, and she had been so grateful that she had brought small gifts for the entire nursing team. Mine was a small paperback New Testament. She was Christian. She had said, "This is the most precious thing I have. I want you to have it." I had thanked her genuinely and placed it in my bag and never opened it. I opened it now, not searching for an argument. I want to be clear about that. I was not looking for theology or evidence or proof. I was looking for a voice that I recognized. The voice I had just heard on the rooftop. I wanted to hear it again in some form. I wanted to find the gardener in the pages, the way you look for someone in a photograph, because you cannot stop thinking about their face. I read slowly. In the morning light on a hospital rooftop, with flowers open around me that had no business being open. I read for a long time. Months passed after that morning. Not easy months. Not months where everything suddenly made sense and settled into place neatly. I have seen those kinds of conversion stories, and I am not telling you that one. What I am telling you is that something shifted in me that morning and it never shifted back. Like a bone that heals slightly differently than it was. Still functional, still me, but different in a way you notice every time you move. I changed quietly. I did not announce anything. I did not give a speech. I did not explain myself to my colleagues or my family. The change showed in smaller things. I stopped rushing through final moments. Before, when a patient was nearing death, I would do what was medically necessary, and I would maintain professional presence, and I would coordinate with the family. All of that, correct and competent, but I would not linger. Lingering felt like indulgence. It felt like a failure of the discipline that had kept me functional for 12 years. I started lingering, not dramatically, just staying, sitting beside a bed when there was nothing more to do medically, holding a hand that was no longer gripping back, being present not because it was required, but because I understood for the first time that presence was not nothing. Presence was something. Presence was, in fact, the most important thing. I began learning names differently. Not just the name on the chart. I started asking patients, in the early days of their admissions before things became urgent, to tell me something about their life. Not a medical history, something real, where they grew up, what they did before they were sick, what they loved. I kept notes. Private ones, not in the chart. In a small book I bought for this purpose. And when I sat with them at the end, I would think about what they had told me. I would hold that person in my mind, the real person, not the diagnosis. The man who used to grow tomatoes on his apartment balcony. The woman who had been a school teacher for 30 years. The teenager who loved football and had never missed a match. I saw people. Actually saw them. I had thought I was seeing them all along. I had thought I was caring for them. And I was. Competently. Completely. But there is a difference between caring for someone and being present with them. And I had not understood that difference until a man I thought was a maintenance worker touched a dying leaf and it turned green. I proposed the volunteer program to hospital leadership 6 months after the rooftop. The idea was simple. No patient in the palliative care ward should die alone. If a patient had no family nearby, a trained volunteer would sit with them. Not to speak necessarily, not to perform comfort, just to be there, to be a human presence in the room when the room was otherwise empty. Leadership was skeptical. I prepared the proposal carefully. I cited studies on the psychological experience of dying patients who were alone versus those who had human presence. I described the practical implementation. I offered to coordinate the training myself on my days off. They approved it. The volunteer program ran quietly at first. Then it grew. Other nurses contributed. Social workers got involved. Chaplains of multiple faiths participated. Within a year, there was a waiting list of volunteers. I planted flowers outside the palliative care ward. This sounds small. It is small. But I want you to understand what it felt like. I researched which plants did well in partial shade. I submitted the landscaping request. I bought the initial plants with my own money because the budget approval would take months, and I did not want to wait months. I drove to the nursery on a Saturday morning, and I walked through it slowly, choosing each one. I thought about open flowers. I thought about a rooftop in the early morning. I chose bright ones, colors that would be visible from the ward windows. Every morning before my shift, I watered them. The other nurses noticed. They thought it was a hobby, a small personal project. They said kind things about how the entrance looked better. Some of them started tending the plants themselves, on days I wasn't working. The garden grew without any announcement. I never told anyone the reason. Some things are yours. Some things belong to a moment that is too private and too complete to be diluted by explaining it to people who weren't there. I am telling you now because I think you were meant to hear it. But at the hospital, in the daily life I lived among people who knew me, I kept it quiet. The gardener had found me quietly. I think he preferred it that way. Years passed. The gardens had spread by then. Not just the palliative ward. A junior nurse had started one near pediatrics. A maintenance worker, a real one, young, with a contagious laugh, had taken over the rooftop and turned it into something remarkable. Patients who could walk sometimes asked to be taken up there. I was doing a morning round one spring when a newly hired nurse fell into step beside me. She was 3 months into the job, sharp, focused, the kind of young nurse who reminded me of who I had been. Certain, controlled, a little walled. We were passing the garden outside palliative care. She looked at it and then at me and said, "Why are there gardens outside practically every ward now?" I stopped walking. I looked at the flowers, catching the morning light. The colors were vivid in the early sun. Someone had added a new section since last week. Tall stems in deep purple and gold. I stood there and I thought about a mathematics professor who had found clarity in his final moments and used it to deliver a message to a stranger. I thought about a woman with no last name and no fixed address, who had gripped my arm with unexpected strength. I thought about a young construction worker, who had looked past his own parents to find my eyes. I thought about a rooftop, an empty cup of cold tea, a leaf turning green. I smiled. Someone once taught me, I said, that healing doesn't always mean staying alive. She waited. She seemed to be expecting more. I bent down and picked up the small watering can I kept beside the garden entrance. I watered the last flower slowly, making sure every root had what it needed, taking my time. The young nurse thanked me and moved on. I heard her footsteps continue down the hall. I stayed where I was, and then it happened. A warm breeze moved through the garden, gentle and sudden, the kind that comes from nowhere on a still morning. The petals of the flowers moved together, a brief soft wave of color, and the scent of the blossoms lifted into the air around me. Full and clean and unmistakable. I looked up instinctively. The hallway was empty. The garden was still. No one was there. I stood for a long moment with the watering can in my hand, and the morning light coming through the windows, and the scent of flowers all around me. And I smiled, because I knew, I have always known, since that morning on the rooftop, that the gardener does not stay in one place. He moves, he tends, he notices every dry and forgotten stem, he touches what is dying and calls it back toward life. And sometimes he walks through a hospital garden in Jordan in the early morning, unseen, leaving only a warm breeze and the scent of blossoms as evidence. I still water the flowers every morning. I still sit with patients who have no visitors. I still write their names in my small book and learn what they loved. And every now and then, in those final quiet moments at a bedside, when the room goes still, and something seems to arrive that I cannot see, but that I can feel the way you feel, a presence in a doorway, before you turn to look. I know he is there. He was always there. He was there before I looked for him. He was there before I had words for him. He was there in every room I had ever walked through, all the years I had been too certain to notice. The gardener still walks there. He never stopped. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to say something directly to you. I did not share this because it was easy. I shared it because I have carried it for years, and I believe some things are meant to be carried outward, not kept. If you found this story, I do not think that was by accident. Maybe you are in a season where you are working very hard to explain something that will not be explained. Maybe you have been closed off for a long time, the way I was, and you have good reasons for that. Maybe something small keeps finding you in unexpected places, and you are trying very hard not to look at it. I just want you to know, the gardener is patient. He does not force doors. He just tends, he waits. And if you are still here, then like me, you still have time. There are more stories on this channel from people who found something they were not looking for. If any of this reached you, stay. The next story might be the one meant for you.